Let's talk about extreme weather. It's happening all over the West, particularly right now, if not the rest of the country. Chairman Harper, let me start with you. In your written testimony, you noted that climate change may exacerbate concentration risks for some credit unions. How is NCUA identifying and working with these credit unions to reduce concentration risks that could be affected by wildfires, floods, or other extreme weather events? And what are these concentration risks that you mentioned?
So when you go in and we look at and supervise a credit union, we will take a look at where its loans are. And one of the areas where you want to take a look at is maybe there are a number of homes within the floodplain or primarily within a floodplain, or maybe it's an area that is more prone to wildfires. Is the credit union taking risk mitigation techniques to make sure that there's insurance there behind the product in order to protect their interest in the equity for which they've made the loan to? That's a little bit of the way that we're looking at it. I tend to think about extreme weather events in a slightly different way in climate change as we're happening. And it's my hometown that I think about. I grew up 2 miles from a major refinery in this country. There's a credit union tied to that refinery. What happens over time as that refinery perhaps changes its product line or moves on to something else? Does the credit union need to change its base on its field of membership? Or just 2 blocks from where I grew, there was a major cornstarch processor taking corn and turning it. What happens when the communities that are affected by the weather events, what happens to the credit union that's connected with that cornstarch processor? So I'm taking a look at the micro and the macro level as we approach this issue.
That's wonderful. And I look forward to the work that you're doing because in Nevada, in the West, as you well know, wildfires are just, it's a daily thing now. And
and I know
it's having a devastating impact to our families, our structures, our businesses, our small businesses that are farmers and ranches on the rangeland. So I'm hoping that is part of your focus as well.
Absolutely. And I know last year when we had the wildfires, we had a number of credit unions that applied for urgent needs grants because, for example, their HVA systems were completely destroyed as a result of the wildfire and they needed, and we helped to fund and make sure that those small credit unions could get access to that.
Great. Thank you. Acting Comptroller Sue, in your written testimony, you recommend the OCC adopt a two-pronged approach to climate change. My question to you is, how will you implement your two-pronged approach? And I'm curious, what is your vision for the climate change risk officer?
So the first prong is to work with our partners and to share best practices. So we joined NGFS, as I mentioned earlier, the Network for Greening the Financial System. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot of different banks have lots of different kinds of exposures, and so it helps to work together with other agencies and our partners to learn what are the best practices. And the NGFS is a good forum. It is the leading forum by which to share those best practices. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. That's a very important thing. We're also working with our interagency partners, particularly the Federal Reserve, which has a climate officer there as well. The vision for the climate officer is to really expand our capacity to work with those stakeholders and to work with banks. Because the bank's risk management practices, some are developed, some are underdeveloped. We need resources to help accelerate the development and adoption of effective climate change risk management practices. And the new risk officer, Darren Benhart, will help with that.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And you mentioned, I guess this is my question for Ms. McWilliam. What are you doing to address the climate crisis? And Acting Comptroller Sue just talked about joining the Network for Greening the Financial System. Is that something you're considering? Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts around
Sure, happy to. Thank you, Senator. So as you know, we're a primary regulator of small banks in the United States. As a matter of fact, 84% of our banks, regulated entities, fall under $1 billion in assets, and a lot of them are actually, frankly, serving small communities like the rural communities in Nevada. For decades, I can't even take credit for this, but for decades, our supervisors have taken into account weather-related events, and as Chairman Harper mentioned, to the extent that you're in a flood flood zone or peril of wind zone or fire zone, our examiners expect banks to take that into their underwriting practices. We have regional risk counsel. We have 6 regional offices, and in each office we have a regional risk counsel. They look at this issue based on that region. So in your region, in Nevada, California, et cetera, that fires would be, earthquakes, et cetera, a prevalent issue to consider, droughts as well for agricultural lending, et cetera. So we're cognizant of the issues here. We know what our entities need to do. Our entities know what they need to do. And if they are not following prudent underwriting practices, protecting the collateral, making sure there is appropriate cash flow resulting from their loans and the businesses that they support, they would be cited in the examinations. We are a part of the Basel Task Force on Climate Change, and we're also working through AFSOC with our sister agencies on understanding how best to attack that.
Thank you. Thank you to all 3 of you. Appreciate the conversation.
Thanks, Senator Cortez Masto. Senator Scott from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Brown. Thank you all for being here with us today, and want to ask a couple of questions.